There is nothing more difficult to carry than victory. Napoleon Bonaparte. Victory is a strange kind of drug. It gives the illusion of clarity, yet it clouds the mind faster than failure ever could. Failure humbles, it slows you down, it makes you analyze every move. But victory makes you believe you are untouchable. It whispers to you that the same force that brought you triumph will keep you there forever. That whisper is the beginning of your undoing. The ancient philosophers warned of this moment long before modern ambition was born. The Greeks called it hubris, that dangerous swelling of pride that blinds men at the height of their power. The moment you believe you cannot fall, you have already stepped over the edge. The problem is that the edge is invisible. Success makes the ground look endless. Think about the moments in history when men rose so high, they lost sight of the ground beneath them. Each time, the same pattern repeats. Clarity at the beginning, blindness at the summit, collapse soon after. Power follows a rhythm. It demands restraint, but restraint feels unnatural when the world bows to you. And that is why those who reach too high often meet their fate not in failure, but in excess. Why do we find it so difficult to stop? Why does the same drive that pushes us to succeed also push us to destroy what we've built? Perhaps it's because ambition is a moving target. Once we achieve what we wanted, the goal no longer excites us. We raise the bar, demand more, and convince ourselves that stopping is the same as dying. The conqueror must conquer something, even if it's himself. But most cannot. They turn their sword inward without realizing it. Every victory plants a seed of temptation, the urge to go just one step further. You start to imagine the next mountain, the next empire, the next level of admiration. And soon, what was once enough becomes irrelevant. The mind adapts to power like the body adapts to pain. It dulls to it. Only more can awaken it again. Yet each more brings you closer to ruin. History's most brilliant men did not fall because of weakness. They fell because they mistook momentum for immortality. When you are in motion, the idea of stopping feels like betrayal. The applause drowns out caution. The crowd, once silent, begins to chant your name, and in their noise, you lose the voice that once guided you. There is a quiet art in knowing when to stop. It is not passive, it is mastery. To stop at the peak, to resist the intoxication of one more victory, requires a kind of strength that few possess. Because stopping means accepting limits, and limits are the one thing power cannot stand. When the sun reaches its highest point, it begins to fall. Nature itself warns us. Perfection cannot sustain itself. It collapses under its own gravity. The wise man reads the signs in time. The fool believes the light will never dim. Every empire in human history has faced this test. Some stop before the edge, transforming strength into stability. Others charge forward, believing the world would keep stretching before them forever. The difference between the two is not brilliance, it's timing. So before we step into the lives of Alexander and Napoleon, ask yourself, at what point does ambition stop being a force of creation and become a force of destruction? At what point does victory become poison? And when that moment comes, would you recognize it? Or would you, like the greats, be blinded by your own light? The answers lie in their stories and in the mirror of their mistakes. He was born beneath the thunder of a storm. Legends said the temple of Artemis burned that same night, as if the gods were clearing space for a new name in the order of power. Alexander of Macedon entered a world already restless. a kingdom sharpening its swords while Athens argued about philosophy. His father, Philip II, had welded together a brutal but efficient state. His mother, Olympias, filled his imagination with myths of heroes who refused to die. Between them, they planted the idea that he was destined not merely to rule, but to eclipse. As a boy, he rode horses no one else could tame. The story of Bucephalus endures because it reveals something elemental. The beast was never conquered by force but by perception. Alexander simply saw what others didn't. The horse wasn't mad. It feared its own shadow. The young prince turned it toward the sun, and suddenly, mastery was his. That small moment carried the pattern of his life. A mind that believed every obstacle hid a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected by will. Aristotle tried to ground him in reason. Under olive trees and endless scrolls, the philosopher taught him logic, ethics, and the golden mean. That virtue lies between excess and deficiency. But ambition learns differently from theory. Alexander admired Aristotle, yet absorbed little of his moderation. Ideas of balance rarely survive the intoxication of youth, especially when the world keeps confirming your genius. Victories are louder teachers than philosophers. When Philip was assassinated, Alexander was 20. The court was chaos, plots, rival claimants, foreign tribes smelling blood. He acted before thought could paralyze him. Rivals were executed, rebellions crushed, and by the time the city-states to the south realized what had happened, the boy had become the state. He marched into Greece not as a supplicant, but as a storm. At Thebes, he made an example so devastating that the word Thebes itself became shorthand for annihilation. The city was burned, its citizens sold, its memory erased. Mercy, he believed, was for the weak moments of peace. Terror was for the moments that built empires. Yet inside that ruthless efficiency lived something more complex than cruelty. Alexander loved Homer. He slept with a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself. He saw Achilles not as myth, but as mirror. And perhaps that was his curse, to model himself after a man who could only live for glory, never for rest. Achilles had one choice: a short life of brilliance or a long life of obscurity. Alexander never questioned which path was noble. When he crossed into Asia, standing on the shore of the Hellespont, he threw a spear into the sand and declared the continent his by right of conquest. It wasn't arrogance alone. It was belief in destiny so complete that doubt itself seemed treason. The first victories came easily. The Persian satraps fell. Darius hesitated, and each success fed the next. Men followed him because he made them feel part of something cosmic. "Do you wish," he asked, "to live forever in the songs of men?" They did. At Issus, he faced the full Persian army for the first time. Outnumbered, hemmed in by terrain, he rode straight for Darius himself. A lightning bolt aimed at the heart. The great king fled, abandoning his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated them with courtesy, which he publicized carefully. Mercy became theater, a new form of conquest. He understood the optics of power before the term existed: brutality when necessary, benevolence when observed. Each triumph enlarged not only his empire but his self-image. In Egypt, he was crowned son of Amun. The priest confirmed what he already suspected, that he was more than mortal. The line between belief and delusion is invisible when entire nations repeat your myth back to you. He founded Alexandria, named after himself as if time itself were an audience waiting for applause. Every act was a rehearsal for immortality. Still, his men saw changes. The easy laughter of the campaign in Asia Minor hardened into command. delivered through silence. Those who questioned him disappeared, politely or permanently. Power was no longer an instrument. It was an environment. The boy, who had once turned a frightened horse toward the sun, now turned whole cities toward his will. And the lesson of Aristotle, that moderation sustains achievement, faded beneath the marching drums. Ambition had become faith. When he looked at maps, he saw not borders but unfinished sentences. Each conquest felt less like a rival and more like a beginning. He told his generals that the world was round and that beyond the Indus another ocean waited. The dream was no longer empire, it was totality. To stop now would be to confess that he was merely human, and after so many victories, the word human sounded small. But success, like a tide, conceals its own withdrawal. The men who had worshipped him began to murmur of exhaustion. The veterans who had followed him from Macedon counted the years lost to dust and foreign tongues. Even as he feasted in palaces, the first cracks appeared: suspicion, paranoia, the quiet understanding that there was nowhere left to go but east. And east meant madness. He could have stopped. The empire was vast, his name eternal, his enemies shattered. Yet what is a conqueror without a frontier? What is victory when there is no next war? In the silence of triumph, Alexander began to hear the faint echo of fear. The fear that stopping would reveal the emptiness beneath the glory. And so, he chose motion over peace. The mark he aimed for was already behind him, but he no longer looked back. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he was no longer simply a king, he was an atmosphere. The Persians, who had once called him invader, now knelt before him in ceremonies he himself barely understood. The Greeks, who had marched out of Macedon with laughter and bravado, looked at their leader and saw someone half transfigured, a man who spoke to gods and expected them to answer. Babylon received him as a sun returning to its zenith, and for a while he believed it. Perhaps everyone did. In that great city, he began to build the empire not of war but of permanence. Architects, philosophers, astronomers, priests, they arrived from every province of his domain. The map of the world was redrawn in halls scented with cedar and oil. He spoke of merging east and west, of blending Persian ritual with Greek rationality, of a new mankind that would recognize him as its bridge. To some it sounded visionary. To others, it sounded like vanity disguised as idealism. But in that moment, who would contradict him? The world itself seemed willing. He had conquered the largest empire known to history, yet peace brought him no satisfaction. Every morning, he awoke with the same restlessness that had once driven him across deserts. The thrill of creation demanded fresh conquests. Administrating was too quiet. Triumph, like any addiction, loses potency once routine sets in. He looked eastward to the edges of his maps and saw blank parchment calling his name. Still, there were omens. Babylon was a city of whispers. In its gardens and courtyards he heard the same phrase repeated: "The gods grow jealous." Victories in the name of civilization had become monuments to one man. The very priests who blessed him in Egypt now prayed privately that he would learn humility. But power deafens the spirit. He had survived too many prophecies of doom to heed another. The banquet halls grew louder. Wine, incense, and exhaustion blurred the days. Companions who had fought beside him since youth began to sense distance. They no longer knew how to speak to their king. The informal camaraderie of the early campaigns had been replaced by rigid Persian etiquette. Men bowing, eyes lowered, the air thick with ceremony. It wasn't mere arrogance. Alexander was experimenting with divinity. If he could convince others that he was touched by gods, perhaps he could convince himself that death would hesitate before claiming him. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, not for alliance alone, but for symbol. East joining West in his own body. At Susa, he ordered thousands of mass weddings between Macedonian officers and Persian women, an audacious attempt to fuse two civilizations through intimacy. The idea was centuries ahead of its time, and yet centuries too naive. You can command an army to march, but you cannot command hearts to belong. Resentment simmered beneath the golden veils. When he visited the oracle at Siwa, the priest greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon. The title clung to him like perfume. From that point on, his gestures changed. He walked slower. His eyes measured distance as though looking beyond mortals. His letters began with phrases not of request, but decree. He was no longer arguing with the world. He was addressing it. But even gods need frontiers. Beyond the Hindu Kush lay India, mysterious and almost mythical to Greek minds. Tales of elephants and endless rivers stirred his imagination. Conquering Persia had been revenge for history. Conquering India would be proof of destiny fulfilled. His generals hesitated, reminding him of the miles behind them, the men buried along the way, the supply lines stretched to thread. Alexander smiled, that calm, unreadable smile that had preceded every impossible victory, and ordered the march. In those years, his power reached both its height and its distortion. The man who had once inspired through brilliance now ruled through exhaustion and awe. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. Clytus the Black, one of his oldest friends, dared to remind him of his father's achievements. In a drunken rage, Alexander killed him with a spear. The next morning, he wept for hours, inconsolable. Yet the pattern was set. Regret could not coexist with command. It was quickly buried under action. The empire looked invincible on parchment, but empires are not made of ink. They are made of obedience, and obedience dries out. As he advanced toward India, entire provinces revolted in his absence. Tax collectors extorted more than kings ever had. Corruption followed every triumph like shadow. The brilliance that had once unified his followers began to fracture into fear. Still, no one could deny the scale of what he had done. From Greece to Egypt to the gates of India, a single continuous dominion. Roads, cities, languages, currencies, all bent toward a single center, the world at his feet. Yet inside that circle of adoration, Alexander began to understand the loneliness of absolute success. No one could challenge him, therefore no one could reach him. Conversation became monologue. Every voice echoed his own. There is a moment in every life when the summit becomes the slope. For Alexander, that moment arrived the instant he realized he could not stop. Victory had transformed from destination to necessity. If he paused, the silence would reveal the futility of the climb. So he kept moving, dragging his army toward the edge of the world, convinced that one more sunrise would finally make him whole. But the horizon always retreats. The march east began like a vision and ended like a hallucination. India was not the golden plain of his imagination, but a continent of humidity and silence, where the air itself resisted movement. The monsoon rains turned roads to rivers. The armor that once gleamed in Persian deserts now rusted overnight. Mosquitoes sang through the tents like invisible arrows. Still, Alexander pressed forward, convinced that the horizon held one final revelation, the edge of the known world, where he could carve his name into eternity. To his weary soldiers, the conquest had already lost its meaning. They had followed him across 10,000 miles of dust, watched friends vanish in mountains, buried children born on campaign. They wanted rest, farms, wives, sleep. He wanted transcendence. Their prayers and his ambition could no longer share the same sky. But power is a trance. Once the drums start, stopping feels like betrayal of the music. They crossed the Indus and met kingdoms unlike any they had seen. Cities built on rivers wider than seas. Kings who rode elephants armored in iron. Priests whose chants seemed older than Greece itself. The encounter should have satisfied curiosity. Instead, it ignited obsession. Each victory deepened the illusion that destiny awaited just one more march ahead. The further he went, the less he could return, because retreat would shatter the myth he had built around himself. At the Hydaspes River, he faced King Porus, a man who refused to kneel. The battle unfolded in thunder and rain, the kind of chaos that erases all sense of order. Elephants crashed through Macedonian lines, their eyes painted red, their riders screaming hymns. For the first time, Alexander's army hesitated. Victory came only through improvisation, a flanking maneuver in the night, a charge through the fog at dawn. When Porus was captured, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Like a king, Porus replied. The answer disarmed him. He restored Porus's throne, a gesture of admiration and of exhaustion. Conquest was beginning to feel like repetition. The men hoped Hydaspes would mark the end. It didn't. Alexander spoke of crossing to the great Eastern Ocean, of new realms beyond the Ganges. To him, the world was a map half-painted. To them, it was an open grave. The murmurs became open defiance at the Hyphasis River. Hardened veterans refused to move. It was not mutiny. It was surrender to nature. Rain, disease, distance, and longing had dissolved the glue of glory. For the first time, Alexander faced a limit that could not be annihilated by courage. He raged, pleaded, threatened, and finally listened to silence. Then he turned back. Chroniclers say he wept in his tent for 3 days, staring at the unseen lands beyond the river. In those tears, the empire reached its true border. Not the geography of India, but the boundary of human endurance. The man who had broken every wall found one built inside himself. The retreat was crueler than conquest. Through the Gedrosian desert they marched, a purgatory of heat where men died standing, tongues swollen, skin splitting under armor. Horses were slaughtered for water. The ocean shimmered mockingly beside them, undrinkable and infinite. When they finally staggered into Persian territory, Alexander's army was a procession of ghosts. He had conquered the world, but not its cost. Back in Babylon, the triumphs resumed. Ceremonies, plans, architects drafting cities yet unborn. But beneath the pageantry ran a new quietness. He drank more, slept less, spoke to omens. The murder of Clytus haunted him. So did the mutiny he had barely contained. He began training Persians in Macedonian tactics, replacing his veterans with fresh faces who would never question him. It was a practical decision disguised as reform. A ruler surrounding himself with mirrors instead of eyes. There is a pattern to overreach. First the victory, then the isolation, then the gesture that proves nothing can stop you. For Alexander, it came when he ordered the ships built to explore the Arabian Gulf, even as disease swept his camps. Fever stalked him through the palaces of Babylon. When it finally struck, he dismissed it as exhaustion. He had outlived too many warnings to take this one seriously. The sickness deepened. His voice failed. Generals filed past his bed in silence. He could no longer speak, but gestured toward his signet ring. Asked to whom he left the empire, he whispered, if he whispered at all, to the strongest. It was not a command. It was an epitaph. The empire shattered within months. The men who had carried him to divinity tore each other apart for fragments of the crown. His body lay unburied for days, the air thick with incense meant to disguise decay. The conqueror who had sought eternity vanished before 33. In the end, there was no new world, no perfect unity, only the echo of one man's refusal to stop. If Law 47 has a human face, it is his, not the youthful hero who tamed a horse or defeated Darius, but the exhausted god who marched beyond reason. His tragedy was not that he failed, it was that he could not recognize when he had already succeeded. Babylon smelled of resin and rot. The body of Alexander lay in a golden coffin, suspended in honey and myth, while outside the palace courtyards buzzed with arguments over succession. The conqueror who had planned cities, calendars, and dynasties had left behind not an heir but a vacuum. For a brief, blinding decade, he had welded half the world together by the heat of his own presence, and now that heat was gone. Empires, like stars, do not go dark quietly, they explode. The generals gathered in whispered councils, each claiming to protect the legacy, each calculating how to divide it. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus the eastern provinces, Antigonus and Lysimachus, the fragments in between. Maps became puzzles soaked in blood. The unity that Alexander had declared eternal dissolved into the very rivalries he had once crushed. His dream of a single world melted into kingdoms ruled by imitation Alexanders, each believing he alone embodied the true continuation of greatness. In Macedonia, the news was received with disbelief. Mothers whose sons had vanished into Asia lit candles and said that perhaps now the dead could rest. Philosophers began debating whether he had been divine or merely mad. Merchants, less poetic, wondered who would pay for the roads and the armies guarding them. The empire had no center anymore, only inertia. Bureaucrats kept issuing decrees in his name long after his voice was gone, as though language itself refused to admit he was mortal. And yet, in a strange way, he had achieved the immortality he sought. The cities he founded, Alexandria most of all, became living memorials. Libraries, marketplaces, temples, the circulation of Greek thought through Eastern veins. These were not accidents. Even in disintegration there was diffusion. Like a shattered diamond, the pieces still reflected light. Hellenism spread farther than his soldiers ever had, infiltrating languages, coins, even religions. But it was a cultural immortality, not the personal one he had imagined. His body decayed, his idea multiplied. His mother Olympias demanded that he be worshipped as a god. Priests hesitated, but she insisted that divinity was hereditary now. In their rituals, you can sense the desperation of humans trying to make sense of a loss that feels like the withdrawal of the sun itself. Yet the myth they created outlived them all. Centuries later, Roman generals would still visit his tomb, touching the coffin as if to borrow courage. Julius Caesar wept when he saw it, lamenting that at his age Alexander had already conquered the world. Greatness, it seemed, had become a contagion that infected every ambitious soul thereafter. But what was the real lesson of his death? Perhaps that power sustained only by one man's motion dies the moment he stops. The machinery of empire depends on rhythm. Campaigns, decrees, victories, ceremonies. When the rhythm ceases, everything trembles. The men who fought beside him had defined themselves by his direction. Without him, they became like arms severed from the body. The tragedy was not only his inability to stop, but the world's inability to continue without him. In the decades that followed, new dynasties emerged from the rubble, each invoking his name to legitimize their rule. The Seleucids in Syria, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Antigonids in Macedon, all fragments orbiting a ghost. Alexandria flourished while his homeland fell into decay. The memory of the man who had united Greece became the excuse for Greeks to fight one another again. It is the eternal irony of overreach. Unity born of a single will cannot outlive the hand that forged it. Travelers who crossed the deserts where his armies once marched found abandoned cities, statues toppled, inscriptions eroded by wind. Only the stories remained, retold in markets and schools. Alexander the Invincible, the Beautiful, the Mad. Each storyteller carved him differently, but in every version, he exceeded the mark. Even death could not stop him from being too much. Look closely though, and you can see the quieter legacy, the caution that hides behind admiration. His name became a proverb for ambition without measure. Parents told their sons, "Be bold, but not like Alexander." Philosophers used him as example when warning pupils that genius without restraint turns inward and devours itself. In that sense, he did teach the world something through ruin. If he could have seen the centuries that followed, he might have realized that immortality is not a life extended, but a story repeated. And stories, unlike empires, do not need thrones to endure. They need meaning. In the emptiness after his passing, the meaning finally appeared, that greatness without limit becomes its own undoing. He had reached the summit of human will, and found there only the thin air where gods choke. From Babylon's silence to Rome's emulation, from his mother's grief to the scholars cataloguing his roots, one truth lingered. The mark had been reached long before he saw it. Everything after was excess. In that excess, the world learned a law it would forget and relearn for centuries, until another man on another continent would repeat the pattern with cannons instead of spears and call it progress. He was born not in the heart of France, but on its farthest edge, on the island of Corsica, where the mountains fall straight into the sea and the wind smells of salt and rebellion. Napoleon Bonaparte entered life in a family too proud for its poverty, the son of minor nobles who still pronounced their names with Italian rhythm. France was his adoptive mother, and like all adoptive children, he loved her with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. He would spend his life trying to prove that he belonged to her, and then that she belonged to him. As a boy, he was solitary, defensive, sharp. He read endlessly. Plutarch, Caesar, the commentaries of those who had bent history into personal testimony. The tales of Alexander fascinated him not for their romance, but for their precision. The way a single will could bend continents. At the military school of Brienne, he learned mathematics, geography, and the science of artillery. But what truly educated him was humiliation. His accent, his origin, his poverty, all made him an outsider. The world told him he was small. He decided to become large enough that the world itself would have to measure by his scale. The revolution gave him his opening. The old order collapsed in noise and blood. Rank and birth lost their monopoly. In chaos, merit could suddenly matter. The artillery officer from Corsica rose because he could think faster than the men above him. At Toulon, he broke a siege with geometry and nerve. At 24, he was a general. Those who met him described a silence around him, a kind of condensed energy. He spoke little, observed everything, and acted as if the future had already been negotiated in his favor. When Paris first heard his name, it sounded foreign. When it saw his victories, it stopped caring. At 26, he married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow older than himself, elegant, connected, worldly. She opened doors to power. He opened the door to myth. Their union was less about romance than mutual necessity, a pattern he would repeat with nations. To him, people were instruments of destiny. To them, he was the music they could not resist. In Italy, he found his stage. The army he inherited was starving, disorganized, cynical. Within months, he turned it into a weapon. He marched them not by brute command, but by persuasion. "Soldiers," he said, "you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." Words alone fed them. Victory after victory followed. Lodi, Arcola, Rivoli. Each battle added a layer to his legend, each speech a new verse in the gospel of his inevitability. The politicians in Paris began to fear the soldier they had created. They sent him east to distract him, with Egypt, with science, with the promise of new commerce. He accepted because distance was opportunity. The campaign failed militarily, but succeeded mythologically. He returned to France not as a general, but as a phenomenon. The people, exhausted by revolution and anarchy, wanted order with glamour. Napoleon provided both. In 1799, he staged a coup that was almost polite. No barricades, no massacres, just precision. He walked into the chambers of government surrounded by loyal grenadiers, declared the old regime obsolete, and offered himself as correction. It was as if he had read the script of Caesar and edited it for efficiency. By the time France realized it had traded liberty for stability, it was already grateful. His rise was not accidental, it was architectural. He built reputation like engineers build bridges, calculating load, stress, and visibility. Every bulletin from the front exaggerated victory. Every portrait presented a new version of the same promise, that genius could replace chaos. He learned to manipulate the two currencies that never devalue, fear and admiration. His soldiers adored him because he shared their dangers. His enemies respected him because he forced them to. And yet, within that discipline burned the same fever that had consumed Alexander. The conviction that rest is decay. Power to Napoleon was not possession but momentum. To stop would mean to confront the void of ordinary life, and he preferred war to introspection. When he looked at Europe, he didn't see countries. He saw unfinished geometry. Borders were lines to be corrected by logic and canon. The first consul became emperor because there was no one left strong enough to object. The ceremony at Notre Dame was the perfection of irony. A son of revolution crowning himself with imperial laurel. The Pope sat as witness, not master. In that gesture, the lifting of the crown by his own hands, lay the entire psychology of Law 47. He had reached the mark he aimed for: control, fame, immortality in print. But control, like any empire, has no natural border. Beyond it waits only excess disguised as destiny. For now, Europe knelt, and Napoleon believed the world was reasonable. But reason, in the mouth of the victor, is merely appetite speaking politely. Paris had never seen such light. The city that had once burned with revolution now glittered with ceremony, its fear transformed into pride. The streets filled with uniforms and silks, banners fluttered from every balcony, and the air smelled of incense and powder. On the morning of his coronation, Napoleon rode through the gates of Notre Dame, not as a servant of France, but as France itself made flesh. The same people who had torn down kings now cheered one, because he had convinced them that this time the crown belonged to merit. He understood the theatre of power better than any monarch before him. The gold, the marble, the music, all instruments of hypnosis. When he took the crown from the Pope's trembling hands and placed it upon his own head, the gesture rewrote the logic of Europe. He was saying, "I am not chosen by God. I am my own proof." That small act, the defiance of divine permission, was the moment he became legend and began to drift toward danger. For what remains sacred when you declare yourself self-made in the eyes of eternity? At first, the empire seemed rational. The Napoleonic Code, civil administration, meritocracy, education. He brought order to chaos. France became a laboratory of efficiency, governed not by aristocrats, but by competence. He believed he was modernizing the world. But modernity under one man's will always bends toward tyranny. Behind the discipline of his system pulsed an ancient hunger to impose symmetry on life itself. Every year brought new victories. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, each name an echo of brilliance. His armies moved like parts of a single organism, directed by the same brain. He seemed able to anticipate the enemy's thoughts, to sculpt battles out of air. Diplomats began to describe him in mathematical terms, force as formula, ambition as theorem. He redrew the map of Europe with the indifference of a geometer correcting a child's sketch. Kingdoms vanished, republics were invented, brothers and in-laws became kings overnight. It was order, but an order made from motion, not stability. And motion demands fuel. Each conquest required another to sustain it. Victories created obligations, territories to govern, debts to pay, enemies to preempt. Peace became an interval too brief to breathe. When he sat at his desk in the Tuileries, staring at maps, he was never admiring his creation. He was calculating its weaknesses. The very success that had made him emperor now imprisoned him in vigilance. Josephine could sense the change. The tenderness that had once been strategic turned into distance. She aged, his ambition did not. Their marriage, once a ladder, became an anchor. He divorced her with ceremony, tears, and coldness, then married Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of the emperor he had defeated. It was political arithmetic, bloodlines to legitimize power. The child born of that union, the King of Rome, symbolized the future Napoleon wanted, a dynasty that would erase his Corsican beginnings. But dynasties require time, and time does not favor the restless. The French people watched all this with mixed awe and fatigue. The revolution had promised equality. The empire offered spectacle. Bread was still scarce, sun still marched east, taxes still climbed. Yet they tolerated it because Napoleon's presence made them feel part of history itself. Even his enemies could not deny his magnetism. When he entered a room, witnesses said the temperature changed. His eyes were calm, almost bored, as though he saw the world in X-rays. No one could meet his gaze for long without sensing the abyss behind it. The cold intelligence of someone who has stopped asking why. By 1810, half of Europe answered to him. Spain groaned under occupation. Prussia obeyed. Austria signed treaties it did not believe in. England alone remained defiant, an island fortress mocking his continental perfection. Trade blockades, alliances, and threats all failed to break it. The British fleet cut his empire at the seams, starving commerce while enriching smuggling. He called it a nation of shopkeepers, but the insult concealed frustration. He could defeat kings, but not markets. The contradiction of Napoleon's genius was becoming clear. He could build everything except stillness. The peace he imposed was not peace, it was suspense. Every ruler who dines with a sword in his lap eventually slices his own hand. Yet from the outside, the world still saw him as invincible. Portraits showed him serene, hand tucked into uniform, surrounded by celestial glow. The man who barely slept was painted as eternal repose. Those closest to him began to notice signs of obsession. He reread the Iliad at night, underlining passages where Achilles defied fate. He compared himself openly to Caesar, Charlemagne, Alexander. Men of destiny, he said, recognize one another across centuries. But destiny is a word that begins as prophecy and ends as diagnosis. The logic of the conqueror admits no cure but exhaustion. When his son was born, bells rang across Paris. For a few days, even he seemed content. Yet contentment was alien territory. He soon returned to his maps, tracing with his finger the eastern plains of Europe, the wide expanse between the Vistula and the Volga. There, he believed, lay the one campaign that would seal history forever. Russia was not just another opponent. It was the last boundary that refused to kneel. And as always, the temptation of one more victory proved stronger than the wisdom of stopping. From the window of his palace, he could see the city he had remade glowing under lanterns. He had everything he had once dreamed of: power, lineage, worship, empire. And yet, in the depths of his silence, the old restlessness stirred again. Perhaps it wasn't the world he wanted to conquer. Perhaps it was time itself. And time, like all empires, cannot be conquered. It can only wait. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon set out from Dresden at the head of the largest army Europe had ever seen. More than 600,000 men marched east: French, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, even reluctant Austrians. They called it the Grande Armée, but it was less an army than a moving city. Supply wagons stretched beyond the horizon. Musicians played marches through the dust, and eagles of gold shimmered on every standard. It was meant to be a demonstration of inevitability, the final act of correction for a continent that refused to accept order. Napoleon told his marshals, "The war will be finished in 20 days. It would last forever in memory." The Russians retreated without fighting. Each mile of silence was a provocation. Villages burned themselves to ashes before the French could enter them. Fields were stripped bare, wells poisoned. The land withdrew like a living organism, avoiding infection. Napoleon mistook patience for fear. He advanced, always expecting the decisive battle that would restore logic to the campaign. But logic had evaporated with the summer heat. What followed was not war. It was attrition against geography. The army starved among abundance that refused to exist. Horses sank in mud. Men marched in circles around mirages. Discipline collapsed under hunger. Soldiers roasted dead horses, stole from each other. And yet the emperor rode ahead, immaculate, composed, as if order were a matter of posture. To the men he still seemed supernatural, and perhaps he believed it himself. The illusion of control outlasts the fact of it. At last, near the village of Borodino, the Russians stood to fight. The battle was apocalyptic. Cannon smoke so thick that the sun turned red. Bodies forming mounds over which artillery rolled. More than 70,000 men fell in a single day. When the smoke cleared, both armies claimed victory, but only silence had truly won. Napoleon held the field, yet refused to deploy his reserves. His instinct, that strange mixture of mathematics and intuition that had never failed him, faltered for the first time. He had won everything except decision. The road to Moscow lay open. The army staggered forward, hollow-eyed, half-mad. When they reached the city, it was empty. The inhabitants had fled. The rest had set it aflame. Moscow burned for days, its domes collapsing like exhausted lungs. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin, his face lit by the reflection of his own ruin. The sight should have broken the spell. Instead, it deepened it. "What a terrible spectacle," he said, "and yet how sublime." He believed that the Tsar, seeing his capital in ashes, would finally sue for peace. But Tsar Alexander remained silent. The silence itself was the answer. Weeks passed. The fires died. The cold arrived. Autumn turned to winter, as if vengeance itself had descended. Napoleon waited for a letter that never came, then for signs of obedience that never appeared. At last, reason spoke. Retreat. It was already too late. The first snow fell like a curtain over the dream of empire. The retreat from Moscow was not a campaign. It was an apocalypse measured in footsteps. The same soldiers who had marched east singing now trudged west without language. Frostbite blackened fingers before dawn. Horses froze standing. Cannons were abandoned like relics of a forgotten faith. Entire divisions vanished overnight. The Russians pursued like ghosts, striking, vanishing, letting cold do the killing. The mighty Grande Armée dissolved into fragments of humanity dragging themselves across white death. Napoleon, usually untouchable by weather or emotion, began to crumble. He rode in silence, cloak stiff with ice, eyes hollow. He still issued bulletins of victory, as if words could replace warmth. Even his marshals could no longer pretend. When the Berezina River appeared, half frozen, half liquid, it might as well have been the Styx. The crossings became slaughter. Men drowned, froze, or were crushed beneath collapsing bridges. And yet, incredibly, he escaped. He left the army to die while he raced back to Paris to preserve power, because power, not men, was the only empire he truly trusted. Of the 600,000 who had set out, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest lay scattered across the endless snow, anonymous beneath drifts and numbers. Europe, watching from afar, realized the spell was broken. The man who had seemed like reason itself had gambled against nature and lost. But the most tragic loss was internal. He still refused to believe he had crossed the mark. He spoke of rebuilding, of vengeance, of new campaigns, as if the world were merely a chessboard in need of rearrangement. In Paris, he greeted astonished officials with a faint smile. "The army is excellent," he said. "It needs only new uniforms." That sentence contained the whole psychology of the conqueror past his aim. The refusal to interpret catastrophe as finality. He had marched into infinity and discovered emptiness, yet his mind translated it as delay. The Russian campaign was not merely a military defeat, it was a moral revelation. It exposed the arithmetic of excess. When success becomes identity, loss becomes unthinkable and therefore inevitable. The snows of Russia were not punishment, they were mirror. They showed Napoleon what he had become, a man who could no longer tell victory from survival. And still, history moved as he had trained it to move, around him. His enemies closed in, alliances shifting like tides. He would fight again, win again briefly, fall again finally. But the essence of his tragedy had already crystallized on the road from Moscow. Alexander had died at 33. Napoleon, at 46, would still be trying to rewrite that ending. Because power never warns you that you've gone too far. It lets you discover it alone, in the cold. When Napoleon returned to Paris after Russia, the myth limped behind him like a wounded animal. He hid the disaster with bulletins written in the same triumphant style as ever. Phrases about strategic withdrawals, temporary hardships, renewed campaigns. But even words can die of exhaustion. France, which had once seen him as savior, now saw the shadow of a gambler who had lost the dice. Mothers no longer cheered parades, they counted coffins. Still, he spoke of rebuilding, of gathering new armies, of striking again. The machinery of denial is one of humanity's most efficient inventions. He did rebuild, astonishingly. Within a year, he fielded another army, younger and smaller, but still disciplined by fear and faith. At Dresden and Leipzig, he fought as brilliantly as ever, geometry against destiny. But genius no longer translated to victory. The world had learned his tactics. Europe united not in ideology, but in self-defense. Even his allies turned. When Bavaria and Saxony defected, the illusion of invincibility cracked beyond repair. In the autumn of 1813, at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, the tide finally turned. Over 2 days of slaughter, his empire bled out. The man who had named his son the King of Rome now commanded a kingdom without loyalty. Back in Paris, ministers whispered, marshals hesitated, and the Senate prepared its betrayal. The same assembly that had cheered his coronation voted his deposition. He tried to negotiate, to charm, to command, but fatigue had dulled his magnetism. Even charisma ages. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon signed the Act of Abdication. The pen that had once redrawn borders now drew the boundaries of his own exile. For the first time, the world moved without asking his permission. He was sent to Elba, an island small enough to mock the scale of his former ambition. There, he played at sovereignty. He organized schools, repaired roads, issued coins stamped Napoleon, Emperor of Elba, as if parody could soften humiliation. He inspected his tiny army of 600 men with the same rigor he had given to the Grande Armée. Visitors described a strange calm about him, but it was not peace. It was rehearsal. The mind that had once commanded continents could not confine itself to a shore. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbons returned with powdered wigs and nostalgia, reminding the people of everything they had once despised. The country sighed under the weight of yesterday. News of corruption, incompetence, and royal arrogance drifted across the Mediterranean like invitations. Napoleon listened, waited, and in February 1815 he escaped. One ship, a few soldiers, and a faith that defied mathematics. The world called it madness. Madness often looks like clarity to those who have nothing left to lose. When he landed on the French coast, the soldiers sent to arrest him approached with weapons drawn. He stepped forward alone and opened his coat. "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor," he said, "here I stand." No one fired. They fell to their knees. By the time he reached Paris, the army had joined him, and the king had fled again. The miracle repeated, a man conjuring a nation out of memory. Yet this time the applause sounded thinner. The 100 days would be his epilogue. He ruled again, but briefly, desperately. Europe united once more, not from fear, but from fatigue. At Waterloo, the final curtain descended. The battle was fought under grey skies heavy with rain, mud-swallowing horses, gunpowder damp, destiny slipping through fingers. For hours it balanced, the old brilliance flashing again, then failing. When the Prussian reinforcements arrived, the French lines broke. Napoleon watched the collapse like a man observing his own reflection distort in water. The spell was broken, not by defeat alone, but by repetition. The world had seen this story before, He abdicated a second time. This time, there would be no Elba near enough for escape. The British sent him to St. Helena, an island of volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, as far from history as geography allowed. There, in damp rooms overlooking grey seas, he began the slow descent from myth to man. His guards treated him with cautious respect, his companions with fading reverence. He dictated his memoirs, revising not only battles but memory itself. In his narrative, he was always rational, always foresighted, always betrayed by mediocrity. It was a final act of control, editing eternity. Years passed in monotony. He walked in circles around a garden barely large enough for pacing, staring at the horizon that never moved. The man who once measured time in victories now measured it in sunsets. His body grew soft, his mind sharper and crueler. He read newspapers aloud, arguing with editors who could no longer hear him. At night, he dreamed of snow and trumpets. In those dreams, he always won. In 1821, illness, perhaps cancer, perhaps fate, ended him. He died murmuring fragments of old names: France, Army, Josephine. The room smelled of medicine and sea. No banners, no music, only the creak of the wind against shutters. He had left behind no empire, no dynasty, no peace, only legend. And like Alexander's, that legend would outgrow its host. The world would argue forever about what he meant. To some, a genius. To others, a monster. But beneath both interpretations lies the same rhythm: ascent, brilliance, blindness, collapse. The human pattern that repeats itself whenever ambition forgets its own boundaries. Napoleon's final exile was not to St. Helena, but to memory itself, trapped in endless retelling, immortal but powerless. Power ends not when it is taken away, but when it stops recognizing itself. He had crossed every mark, defied every warning, rewritten every rule, until even victory refused to speak his language. The silence of that island, the sound of waves against rock, was the last conversation between a man and his limits. There is something quietly terrifying about the idea of enough. It sounds peaceful in theory, a word of closure, of balance. But to those who have tasted victory, enough feels like surrender. Alexander couldn't accept it when the world knelt before him. Napoleon couldn't accept it when the map of Europe glowed beneath his crown. And we, in smaller ways, face the same blindness. The line between ambition and addiction is invisible until it's already behind us. Restraint is perhaps the rarest of virtues, because it contradicts everything evolution taught us. Survival rewarded the hungry, the restless, the discontent. We learned to chase, to climb, to improve. Stopping felt like extinction. But civilization changed the game while keeping the instincts. We continue to run long after the danger has vanished, exhausting ourselves in pursuit of ghosts. The same fire that once kept us alive now keeps us from peace. Why do we need to win again and again? Because success never feels the way we imagine it will. The moment of triumph is always shorter than the labor that preceded it. The applause fades, the trophy gathers dust, and suddenly the void returns. The conqueror inside us whispers that maybe the next victory will be the one that satisfies. It never does. Like an addict increasing the dose, ambition raises its own ceiling until collapse becomes the only form of rest. To stop requires more courage than to continue. Anyone can move forward under momentum. It takes strength to walk away while the road is still open. The art of knowing when is not written in any manual. It is sensed, in the quiet after achievement, in the strange fatigue that follows applause, in the feeling that the pursuit itself has begun to own you. Most people ignore these signals. They interpret the discomfort of completion as boredom and rush, to fill it with new projects, new wars, new validations. They call it drive. History calls it decline. What would have happened if Alexander had turned back after Persia, content to build rather than conquer? If Napoleon had stopped at the Rhine and ruled instead of chasing eternity through the snow? The question is rhetorical. Their nature forbade it. They were not men who conquered. They were men who had to conquer. That is the tragedy of greatness without boundaries. It mistakes momentum for purpose. The moment the movement stops, meaning collapses. And so the movement must never stop, even if it leads to ruin. But restraint is not weakness. It is control of control itself. The ability to master the impulse to dominate. Power that cannot stop consuming will eventually consume itself. The truly wise understand that decline begins not with defeat, but with excess. Every empire, every career, every relationship that burns too hot eventually turns its own brilliance into ash. Look around at the modern world. The same pattern repeats, just with new costumes. The entrepreneur who cannot stop expanding until the company implodes. The artist who destroys his own gift by chasing every ounce of attention. The politician who keeps running until the crowd turns. Even in love there is overreach, the urge to possess until nothing remains. The law is not ancient, it's biological. To practice restraint is to resist the intoxication of momentum. It is to see the edge approaching and step back while others keep running. But how can one tell where the edge is? It rarely announces itself. It arrives as subtle signs. Success feels heavier instead of lighter. Victories bring anxiety instead of joy. The applause sounds distant. When everything you touch begins to turn to work rather than wonder, you are already close to the mark. That is when the wisest retreat, not in fear, but in preservation. Restraint requires faith that the story will survive without you. Most cannot bear that thought. They need to sign their names on the last page of history, unaware that the ink of glory fades faster than the ink of wisdom. The few who stop early enough, Marcus Aurelius laying down power, Washington refusing a third term, the quiet rulers who built rather than burned, achieve a different kind of immortality, not through endless motion, but through dignified completion. There is an irony at the core of human ambition. We worship movement, yet what we truly crave is rest. Every pursuit, however grand, secretly aims toward the peace of having arrived. But when arrival finally comes, we panic. Stillness feels like death to the ego. So we run again, confusing exhaustion for purpose. And so history spins endlessly, powered by those who cannot bear the silence after victory. Knowing when to stop is an act of intelligence disguised as humility. It is not the denial of ambition, it is its highest refinement. The painter who knows when to stop adding strokes, the writer who knows when to end the sentence, the ruler who knows when to leave the throne. These are the rare few who conquer not the world, but themselves. Restraint is the final conquest, and yet it is never celebrated. Statues are not built for those who walked away at the right time. They are built for those who fell dramatically. That is why history repeats this lesson endlessly, because we admire the fire more than the discipline that controls it. We crave the spectacle of collapse because it excuses our own inability to stop. The truth, however, is simple and merciless. Every victory has a hidden expiration date. To ignore it is to let success rot into decay. To recognize it is to preserve meaning beyond the moment. There is no shame in stopping, only in not knowing when. those who master this art leave behind something more powerful than glory: balance. When the applause fades, what remains? The air still trembles with the echo of victory, but the echo is not the sound. It's memory pretending to live a little longer. The crowd disperses, the banners are folded, the stage goes dark. You stand alone, surrounded by the ghosts of every ambition that once animated you. This is the moment most people fear, the silence after the noise. The silence that asks, "Now what are you?" when you are no longer becoming. Alexander and Napoleon both heard that silence and mistook it for challenge. They believed the absence of applause meant the world was asking for another performance. But the silence was not asking, it was offering. It was the universe handing them the rarest gift: completion. They could not accept it. Completion felt like death, and in a sense, it was. The death of striving, the death of self built on motion. They chose the noise instead, and the noise devoured them. Every human being will meet this moment in some form. The student after graduation, the artist after masterpiece, the leader after triumph. The taste of victory fades, and a strange emptiness follows. This is where the law speaks most directly. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. In the stillness that follows success, learn to stop. Not because you lack courage, but because courage without restraint becomes recklessness wearing a crown. It is not the climb that destroys people. It is the inability to descend with grace. Mountains are seductive because they promise perspective, but no one tells you how cold it is at the top, how thin the air becomes. The summit is not meant for living. It's meant for looking, for understanding, and then returning. The wise descend before they collapse. The proud stay until gravity reminds them what they are. This law is not a condemnation of ambition. It is its purification. Ambition is sacred when it serves creation. It becomes poison when it refuses rest. There is a rhythm to all great endeavors, a pulse that demands pauses between beats. Without that rhythm, even the greatest melody turns to noise. The pause is not the end of the song, it's what gives it shape. But the world will never encourage you to stop. Society worships expansion, growth, endless forward motion. More is its gospel, faster its prayer. We applaud exhaustion, we romanticize burnout, we mistake noise for progress. Those who choose restraint are called afraid. Those who choose excess are called heroes, until they crash, and then we call them fools. The cycle keeps turning because it flatters our desires. It tells us that limits are for the lesser, when in truth, limits are the boundary between power and madness. Look closely at history, and you'll see the same pattern drawn in different colors. Empires, corporations, artists, lovers, each rises, peaks and falls, not because of weakness, but because they could not interpret the signals of completion. They cross the invisible line where passion turns to compulsion, confidence to arrogance, success to excess. The fall always begins as an echo of triumph. To live by this law is to accept something profoundly uncomfortable, that not every horizon must be chased. Some must be admired from afar. The mature soul understands that legacy is not built by how much you conquer, but by what you preserve. The ultimate act of power is not expansion, it's restraint. To stop, consciously, before the world forces you to. To step away while the applause still lingers. In the end, greatness is not measured by how far one goes, but by when one decides to stop going. The most powerful figures in history are not those who burned the longest, but those who knew when the flame had already said enough. To stop is to choose mastery over intoxication. It is to see that immortality doesn't come from motion, but from dies, the lesson survives. If you listen carefully, you can hear the silence that Alexander and Napoleon never could. The silence that doesn't ask for more. The silence that says, "You have done enough." It is not empty. It's full of peace. The kind of peace that comes only after you've proven everything there was to prove and realize that the proving was never the point. Power will tempt you to move forever. This law asks you to stand still for once, to recognize that the highest point of achievement is the beginning of decline, and that the only way to stay above it is to stop climbing. The silence after applause is not a void, it's home. Like, subscribe, comment, or don't. You are the master of your own life.